Если на отчизну нагрянет беда, позовет солдата труба. Армия моя, ты на страже всегда, ты моя любовь и судьба, обыкновенная, судьба нелегкая, военная, любовь суровая, но верная, готовы мы на ратный труд. Мы все испытаны, не разбивая маршами, и от солдата и до маршала, одна семья, одна семья. Наш октябрь с нами в готовном строю, с нами песни красных бойцов. Первый день войны и победный салют, и судьба погибших отцов. Обыкновенная, судьба нелегкая, военная, любовь суровая, военная, готовы мы на ратный труд. Мы все испытаны, не раз, не два, воями, маршами, мы от солдата и до маршала, одна семья, одна семья. За наши годы разрыва вода, не поет, как прежде труба. Армия моя, ты на страже всегда, ты моя любовь и судьба. Обыкновенная, судьба нелегкая, военная, любовь суровая, но верная, готовы мы на ратный труд. Мы все испытаны, не раз, не два, воями маршами, мы от солдата и до маршала, одна семья, одна семья.
Hello, everyone. Welcome to another interview from the Midwestern Marx Institute for Marxist Theory and Political Analysis. We're happy to have on today Carlos Martinez to discuss his work on the Soviet Union, Socialist China, and the new Cold War that's being waged against Russia and China. So with that, I'd like to pass it over to Noah to introduce Carlos Martinez.
Carlos Martinez is the author of The End of the Beginning, Lessons of the Soviet Collapse, the co-founder of No Cold War, and co-editor of Friends of Socialist China. He also runs the blog Invent the Future. And let me just say real quick, it's a pleasure to have you on, Carlos. Thank you so much for coming on with us.
Thank you very much for inviting. An honor to join you guys.
For sure, I'll get started with the first question then. So we were very interested in your recent interview with the Press Project about the special military operation in Ukraine, the Nazi coup government in Kyiv, and the U.S. empire's role in everything. Without going too in-depth about the entire situation, because we're pretty sure our audience already knows the basics, but could you talk a little bit more about that interview and your thoughts on recent developments in the Donbass?
Sure. I mean, in terms of the interview, I really wanted to just knock down this idea that the conflict in Ukraine is a product of some kind of psychopathology of Vladimir Putin, which is kind of how it's presented. If you talk to your average person in the West, certainly in Britain where I live, people think that, Putin's gone mad, the Russians have gone crazy, they want to reestablish the Soviet Union, they want to reestablish the Tsarist Empire, they want to take over the Ukraine. And my focus with that interview and with other articles that I've written on the subject and interviews that I've given has been to try and explain that Ukraine is not really the crux of this conflict. Like a battle between Russia and Ukraine is not really what this is about. It's the crux of the conflict is essentially a proxy war between NATO, which means the United States, and Russia. And that, obviously follows on from the collapse of the Soviet Union, it follows on from the Cold War, but then the Soviet collapse and the sort of differing expectations, I think, in the West and in Russia as to what post-Soviet Russia would look like. I think, the Russians assumed, like the Russian ruling class, the social class, which had essentially dismantled socialism, they were expecting to be brought in, at boardroom level, to a US-led imperialist system. But the West was like, yeah, we'll bring you in, but it's you can have a role as a cleaner, maybe. The idea was that that Russia would fit in to this imperialist system as very much a junior partner, very much a subsidiary, that its labor, its natural resources, its land, its territory would be made available to principally the US and its close allies. And essentially, that's what they got in the 90s. That's what you got with the Yeltsin administration. You got more or less subservience. You got acceptance of economic austerity, of neoliberalism, of privatization, of this massive, unprecedented attack on the Russian working class, which went from having stability, having jobs, having basic security, having pensions, having education, having healthcare. Like there were lots of problems in the Soviet Union in the 1980s, but people had the basics. They had their basic human rights met, and all of that just disappeared in the 1990s. And I think that kind of clash of expectations really set in motion the conflict that's been emerging ever since, especially since around 2000, especially since Putin came to power and started cracking down to some degree on, the so-called oligarchs and started standing up for the Russian national interest. There was a real sense of betrayal in Russia, especially following the war in Yugoslavia, which was, there's obviously parallels between that war in Yugoslavia in 1999 and what's going on in Ukraine now, but that was essentially a war of NATO domination and NATO expansion. Then you had, contrary to promises that had been made to Gorbachev, you had the expansion of NATO in 1999 with the Czech Republic, Hungary and Poland joining. 2004, Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, Romania, Slovakia, Slovenia. So it was becoming clear, it's been clear to, I think, the majority of people in Russia, including its ruling class, that the United States does not accept Russia as an equal player. It does not respect Russian sovereignty and independence. And as far as the US is concerned, the only position available to Russia in the world system is one of subservience. As part of that, the US has been interfering in Ukraine for at least 30 years, which again is about essentially bringing Ukraine into the US orbit, taking it out of Russia's orbit. As you very well know, there was the Maidan coup in 2014, which was a pro-EU and pro-US and anti-Russian coup, following that the start of the war in Donbass. And this has all been driving towards setting Ukraine's membership of NATO in train and establishing that 2,000-kilometer border between a NATO power and Russia. And meanwhile, Russia's obviously got an important role to play in terms of the new Cold War on China and this long-term strategy, which is aimed at encircling China, containing China, suppressing its rise, and the maximalist goal is to roll back the Chinese Revolution. And that's a project that's been in place since 1949, right? But in recent years, with the pivot to Asia, with the Trump's trade war and general escalation against China, and now with Biden, with AUKUS, with the undermining of the One China policy and so on, the new Cold War against China, this hybrid warfare process against China is really ramping up. And for the US, that's a big part of the prize with Russia. If they can use the situation in Ukraine to destabilize and undermine Russia and to ultimately replace the current administration with a subservient, a pro-Western administration, then that's a very important launch point for them to ramp up their war against China. And that's sort of what I tried to explain in the interview, the Press Project interview, is that this is the context. This is a geopolitical context which runs very deep. It's not just a matter of the Russians have decided that they want to expand their territory. The Russians are defending their basic national interest. They're defending their sovereignty, and they're defending their borders. And that's the reason for the escalation. That's the reason for the special military operation. It's a preemptive strike. And, I say that as someone who's not an uncritical supporter of the special military operation, in the sense that I think it's clearly very risky, like the fact that you've now got Sweden and Finland on the verge of joining NATO. You've got a consolidated anti-Russia, anti-China alliance, which is based around US interests. You've got, the US is really increasing its hegemony in Europe. If you compare that with a year or two ago, when Europe was sort of trying to navigate a position between the US on the one hand and Russia and China on the other, you had Bachelet in power Merkel in power in Germany, who had grown up in Eastern Europe, who was a fluent Russian speaker, who had some kind of rapport with Putin, who had some kind of, she's a reactionary, capitalist politician, don't get me wrong, but she had some kind of understanding of humanity's trajectory towards multipolarity. And she tried to find a middle ground that was friendly with the US, but also friendly with China, also friendly with Russia. That situation seems kind of unimaginable now. If you look at the state of the current German administration, if you look at what's going on in Britain, what's going on in France, these countries in Europe, the key countries in Europe have come completely 100% into the US camp. NATO is looking stronger than it has done for quite some time. So in a sense, I think it's very probable that Russia didn't have a choice in doing what it's done, but it comes with very clear risks. And I suppose to some degree, the response from the West, the strength of the response, and the willingness of the US, incredibly cynically, to as we've referred to it, fighting to the last Ukrainian, would have been difficult to anticipate. They're supplying vast quantities of heavy weaponry and cash to the Kiev regime in order specifically to keep the crisis going. They're doing everything they can to prevent a negotiated diplomatic solution, because everyone knows what a diplomatic solution looks like. It's obvious. It means, yes, protecting Ukrainian independence, but at the same time, acknowledging Russia's very serious and legitimate security concerns. It means ensuring that Ukraine is neutral, that is not a NATO member. It means protecting the national rights of the peoples of Donbass. And the US can't accept that, right? Because it constitutes a major disruption of its strategic plans. They much prefer the chaos that we've got on, they much prefer what's essentially, potentially turning into a never-ending war, because they're hoping that it's going to fundamentally weaken Russia, damage the credibility of the Putin government. What they'd like is for Putin to be replaced, as I said, with a US-friendly government that's subservient to US interests, and for Russia to then join in with this long-term hybrid warfare and containment and encirclement project against China. And here we are 9 months later. But if it weren't for the US's insistence on avoiding a negotiated solution, on doing everything it can to oppose the diplomatic process, the special military operation would have been over in 9 days, never mind 9 months. In terms of what you said about the situation in Donbass now, I think we're all agreed, and I think it's pretty clear to everyone, including reactionaries and people that oppose it, that the incorporation of Donetsk, of Lugansk, of Zaporozhye and Kherson into the Russian Federation represents the will of the people of those regions who have suffered under 8 years of incredibly traumatic warfare, in which 15,000 people have died. It's never been in the news. You don't read about it on CNN. You don't read about it in The Guardian. You don't read about it in Fox News. But that's a war that's been going on. What Russia's military operation is an escalation of that war, but it's an existing war, right? So, and furthermore, the violence has been accompanied by an attack on Russian culture, an attack on the Russian language. Soviet symbolism has been banned, while Ukrainian ultranationalism has thrived. And when I say Ukrainian ultranationalism, what I mean is fascism. The people who defeated the Nazis are condemned, but the people who supported the Nazis are celebrated by the Kiev regime. And that's like written into law. So, these regimes have been incorporated in, these regions have been incorporated into the Russian Federation. I don't think that's a reversible process now. And whatever people think about it, maybe people don't like it, but the blame for that doesn't lie in Moscow. The blame for that lies in Washington and Kiev. At any point up until February this year, the US and Kiev could have recognized the national rights of the peoples of the region, could have given them representation within a federal system, right? And then, after February, at any point between February and August this year, they could have recognized the independence of Donetsk, they could have recognized the independence of Lugansk, and could have come to a negotiated peace with Russia. But they kept pushing this maximalist strategy. And the result is, whether people like it or not, these regions have joined Russia, and that's a permanent arrangement.
Well said. I really like that you bring up Yugoslavia and NATO's attack on Yugoslavia, because it's so often overlooked in the West. Sometimes people even bring up NATO expansion, but then forget, the role that the IMF and the World Bank played in dismantling the Yugoslav economy, and then the horrific bombings voted for, by Bernie Sanders and progressives in the West that happened in 1999, as well as the NATO and U.S. backing of the Kosovo Liberation Army, a terrorist group. Yeah, I think that's important historical context, as well as the fact that this war in the Donbass started in 2014. It didn't start with the Russian invasion. That was an escalation. So I think it's really important that you bring that up and give the historical materialist perspective and give that historical context to the issues. That kind of leads into the next question, though. A lot of people have been talking about a potential move to socialism for Russia. As you said, they've been cracking down on the oligarchs, been using state-run energy to reinvest in building up the Russian economy. We've seen a growth in popularity and power of the KPRF, the Communist Party of the Russian Federation. So does this symbolize a move towards socialism for Russia or not? Do you have any thoughts on this? Yeah.
Well, I think we'd all like a Soviet reunion, but, and I'm definitely not an expert on modern Russian politics, but I guess the idea of Russia kind of undergoing some transition towards socialism in the current period strikes me as, maybe somewhat wishful thinking to a degree. The ruling class in Russia, it's not the same as the ruling class in China, or the same as the ruling class in Cuba or in Vietnam or in the DPRK or in Laos. Those countries have got a lot of shared interests, and they're both all of those countries are pursuing a shared kind of multipolar and anti-imperialist strategy, but you've got a different social class in power. The ruling class in Russia is still the same capitalist class that dismantled the Soviet Union, that very deliberately and intentionally got rid of socialism in order to expand their wealth, in order to expand their power. Their ideology, their baseline ideology is Russian nationalism, not Marxism. Now, what's true is that, there's always been a level of divide within the Russian ruling class between, you know, a relatively more Western aligned section and a relatively more kind of nationalist and patriotic section. And the latter now has very much got the upper hand because, you know, essentially history has proven them right. You know, history has proven that Russia can't trust the West, can't trust the US with its sovereignty, with its independence. It can't expect and it can't hope to be treated as as an equal player, as we were talking about before. And definitely Vladimir Putin is representative of that stream that understands that, you know, the West is not on Russia's side, and you know, and that wants to be more assertive about Russian national interests. You know, and there's some crossover with the question of socialism because Russia is a very special case, you know, because the Soviet Union was the world's first socialist country. And there are successes that the Soviet Union had that the Russian, even capitalist class, you know, kind of wants to accrue to its own legacy as well. You know, when we talk about the heroic Soviet efforts in World War II, the defeat of Nazism, the liberation of Europe, you know, those are the victories of the Soviet working class. And of course, you know, Russia wants to maintain that legacy. But yet then it's got a very kind of mixed understanding of Russian and Soviet history. In a sense, it's like it sees one history of Russian history that includes, you know, Ivan the Terrible, Peter the Great, Tsar Nicholas II, and then, you know, the Soviet period. You know, it's kind of pro-Stalin on the basis that, you know, it was under Stalin that the Soviet Union went from an underdeveloped country to a developed country, and it was under Stalin that the Soviet Union defeated Nazi Germany and liberated Europe, and obviously and massively expanded Russia's kind of influence in world affairs. But it sort of opposes Lenin on, you know, a number of social issues, and, you know, and most particularly on the national question. And that even comes out in Putin's speeches recently. You know, he talks about how, you know, Lenin and the Bolsheviks sort of set the current problems up by making concessions to Ukrainian nationalism and to the other minority nationalisms. You know, on which basis I'm completely disagreed with that, because, you know, Lenin referred to the Russian Empire as the prison house of nations. You know, he recognized that Russia pre-revolution was an imperialist power. So, you know, this ruling class is not ideologically socialist. However, it is kind of populist. It is highly attuned to the needs and the interests and the opinions of the population as a whole. I think that the working class in particular continues to have basically fond memories of socialism. And so, yeah, definitely Soviet nostalgia has a certain amount of sort of populist value, but it does seem unlikely to me that this Russian capitalist class would give up power willingly, you know, for example, by the KPRF winning a majority in a parliamentary election or whatever. Actually, the history of the elections, even in recent times, has been of, you know, KPRF's votes being stolen. You know, I've no doubt that ultimately a path exists for socialism to return in Russia. You know, I'm absolutely 100% convinced about that. But I very much doubt that that path involves, you know, the Russian capitalist class sort of accepting that, well, we got it wrong when we dismantled socialism, and actually that, you know, Marxism is the best way to organize society.
So, wait, what you're telling me is the people saying Putin is secretly still a Soviet man and a tanky and everything good, they're wrong?
I kind of think so, yeah.
That's a really good segue to our next question, and I want to pull up your book for people to see it. I'm going to share it as well in chat when you get your answer, but the end of the beginning, I don't know if everyone can see it there, but so my question is, one of the most impressive and overlooked achievements of the Soviet Union, which your book covers really well, is the elevation of the masses' cultural life. Although the basically universal abolition of illiteracy is very impressive, it also went much further than that. Regular working people had home libraries, they were subscribed to various journals, and they visited the theater and museums at a rate that was a lot more frequent than anything seen in the capitalist West. Can you speak a little bit about the role of cultural development within the Soviet Union?
Sure, that's really interesting, and it's an important question, because the reality of what the Soviet Union was like on those matters contrasts so massively with what people's kind of prejudices are and what the stereotype of Soviet life was. Like I quote in the book an African proverb: "Until the lions have their own historians, the history of the hunt will always glorify the hunter." You know, the history books are by and large written by the victors of the Cold War. So the history of the Cold War is taught by the imperialists, and that means that sort of people's general impression of the Soviet Union is that it was grey and miserable. There was no freedom of expression. There was no real cultural life. There was no creativity. You know, masses maybe sat at home listening to Stalin's speeches on the radio, and that was culture for them. And that's kind of how the Soviet Union was always painted. That was the Cold War caricature. And you know, it's a bit of a digression, but it always struck me as incredibly cynical how the U.S. ruling class, you know, including the slavocracy, you know, and people who've built their entire system on racism and white supremacy, like so cynically leveraged, like what Samir Amin has referred to as black genius, like, you know, jazz, hip hop, the blues, you know, tap dancing, and all of these aspects, all of these things that came out of the African American experience and the experience of slavery. The U.S. ruling class, even while it was still imposing segregation, was using these things as examples of how dynamic and creative the United States was, and how, you know, how capitalism was so inherently so much better than socialism. It could produce this amazing creative stuff. You know, one very important thing to say about education and culture in the USSR is that they were free, right? And that's really, you know, that's a really important point, because it immediately breaks the monopoly of the rich. It means that cultural life isn't just the preserve of people who can afford it, but it's the collective property of the people. And museums, libraries, theaters, concert halls, youth clubs, these were all established in, you know, huge numbers throughout the country, and, you know, very much not just in Russia, but throughout the Caucasus, throughout the Baltics, throughout Central Asia. You know, if you and they were used by ordinary people. Like if you go to the theatre in London even now, the class position of the people in the audience is on average, I would say, very privileged, like upper middle income at least. You know, it's a small minority of people that can engage with culture like that, because it costs loads of money. Whereas in the Soviet Union, it was workers and it was peasants enjoying galleries, theaters, museums, concerts, just as a matter of course. You know, and the surveys routinely indicated that there was no substantial correlation between income on the one hand and kind of engagement with cultural and intellectual life on the other. So like you've got, you know, ordinary workers, the vast majority of them, reading books, reading newspapers, attending theaters, attending concerts. And on the basis of that mass access, you had, you know, amazing advances in music, in dance, in literature, in art. You know, UNESCO reported that in the 1970s, the average Soviet citizen read more books and saw more films than the people of any other country. And this was all done in combination with like an incredibly progressive nationalities policy. So the Soviet Union Constitution from 1936 calls for complete equality of rights for all nations within the Soviet Union, the right of nations to self-determination, and the unity of the workers of all nations. So, you know, in the cultural sphere, this meant producing a sort of inclusive Soviet culture that celebrated all the component national cultures, be it Ukrainian, be it Armenian, be it Uzbek, be it Kazakh. You know, there were obviously, you referenced literacy, and there were mass literacy campaigns throughout the country, which is a very important part of promoting national cultures. Literally, scripts were developed. You know, they had linguists developing scripts for languages, like small languages that previously didn't have scripts. Like in Kyrgyzstan, in Central Asia, it was estimated that 0.2% of people were literate before the revolution in 1917, whereas 30, 40 years later, by the middle of the 20th century, illiteracy had been more or less eradicated across the entire country. From the very early on, from the 1920s, huge numbers of books were produced in all the different languages of the Soviet Union. You had all the major towns had theaters, had like repertory companies that were performing local material as well as Russian material, as well as international material, as Shakespeare and whatnot. And that leads into the point that it was an anti-racist society. Like the Soviet Union had anti-racism written into its constitution and written into its legal system way, way, way before those things existed in the US or Britain. While the US was still suffering under Jim Crow, the Soviet Union, the 1936 constitution says any direct or indirect restriction of the rights or of, conversely, any establishment of direct or indirect privileges for citizens on account of their race or nationality, as well as any advocacy of racial or national exclusiveness or hatred and contempt, is punishable by law. And you had very famous anti-racist campaigners, people like W.B. Du Bois, people like Langston Hughes, people like Paul Robeson, who visited the Soviet Union as early as the late 1920s and early 1930s, and affirmed that this is the first country that has really seriously tackled the issue of racism in a meaningful way. Du Bois said, "The Soviet Union seems to me the only European country where people are not more or less taught and encouraged to despise and look down on some class, group, or race." So yeah, in terms of the overall development of culture, you had parallel to that incredible developments in science and technology, the launching of the first space satellite, the first human in space, amazing developments in industrial manufacturing, and all the rest of it. And this was, as I said, ultimately built on a socialist system. It was built on mass access to literature, to culture, to sport, to science, to technology, to education.
That's
Wow.
that's wonderfully said. You touched on the issue of race, and there's a quote of yours from that book that I find so important, which is, "You can't have capitalism without racism, and you can't have socialism with racism." And I think that the policies of the USSR show that very clearly. But I wanted to say something about that elevation of cultural life, which really destroys the dichotomy that exists for cultural life in the West, where it's just this product of the upper classes, and then there's like popular culture, and then the higher culture. The USSR actually realized the universal project of enlightenment that the West thinkers continue to pay lip service to. And in what's interesting is that the position that Anatoly Lunacharsky held as what in the US we would call the director of education, the Ministry of Education, over there was called the Commissar of Enlightenment. So it's interesting how these universalist values that come from the Enlightenment period, they cannot be achieved under bourgeois society. And the closest we see to this universal Enlightenment project, I think, was the USSR.
Yeah, I think that's very much the case. And the Enlightenment is sort of meaningful in bourgeois society when capitalism is a rising system, right? In the early 19th century, you can say that in Germany and France and Britain, then Enlightenment ideas have some meaning. But at different points in history throughout the 19th and 20th century, capitalism becomes increasingly redundant. It becomes increasingly obvious that capitalism is no longer pushing society forward. It's not pushing, it's not playing, it's lost its progressive role. Once feudalism is defeated, capitalism doesn't have a progressive role anymore, historically. It's not pushing society forward. It's not pushing the productive forces forward. It's not creating a better life for people. And it's increasingly clear that capitalism doesn't actually have the solutions to humanity's kind of outstanding problems. Capitalism can't solve inequality. Capitalism can't solve poverty. Capitalism can't solve starvation. Capitalism can't solve homelessness. Capitalism can't solve this, obscene, disgusting inequality where you have, on the one hand, billionaires who've got access to absolutely everything and who waste it, who don't even do anything good with it. I wouldn't even feel bitter about it if some of these people did something worth doing, but they're just useless waste of space people. And then you've got you've got masses of people that don't have access even barely to a decent education, and they're fed our modern equivalent of bread and circuses. And meanwhile we're just teetering further and further to the brink of nuclear war and nuclear holocaust. So in the modern era, it's completely clear that the bourgeoisie can't even embrace its own values, as you've said, Enlightenment values. It comes down to the global working class. It comes down to socialism and Marxism and ultimately communism to take those ideas further, to refine them, to improve them.
Even when they pay lip service to it, it ends up doing nothing. The sort of liberal bourgeoisie of our era often talk about equality and rights for marginalized communities, but no matter who's in charge, no matter what politicians say, whatever, life for the masses never changes. That equality gets worse and worse every year, despite all the flowery words. And I hate to bring it from such an inspiring moment as the Soviet Union uniting self-determination with the unity of all these people to their collapse. But I just got to say, I haven't read it yet, but your next book, your book is coming in the mail, and I can't wait for it. My family's actually from the Soviet Union, so it's really a special interest for me. Most of my knowledge on the collapse, though, it comes from Karen's book, Socialism Betrayed. How does yours compare to that one? Are there any central themes or parallels you could share with us?
So, I mean, the Kieran and Kenny book is great. Socialism Betrayed. I strongly encourage people to read it. It's one of the first books I read on the collapse of the Soviet Union. I read it a couple of times, albeit the last time, maybe 5 years ago. And I'm in contact with the authors, and they're great people. I think they're involved in the ML Today website. So it's an excellent book. The David Kott's book is also really good. Revolution from Above. Bahman Azad has got an excellent book on the Soviet Union. Michael Parenti's Black Shirts and Reds has got, it's not specifically about the Soviet collapse, but it's got some fantastic insight into it. The Kieran and Kenny book, in as much as I remember correctly, it's got a big focus on what they refer to as the second economy, like the parallel semi-legal economy, where, you have people maybe, they've got a factory job and they run a little workshop out of their garage on the side, or they're stealing, pilfering some bits and pieces, from their workplace and selling them into the black market, etc. And what Kieran and Kenny really focus on is how this second economy created a social class that had a vested interest in capitalism. And this class then infiltrated and to some degree merged with the leadership of the Communist Party of the Soviet Union, particularly under Gorbachev from 1985. I think, that's historically, it's really interesting. It's a really important point. I think I guess if I'd written that book about that particular kind of slice of history, I would kind of clarify, because one conclusion you can draw from that book is that it's like any economic activity outside of the system of central planning, by definition, undermines socialism, and then that brings up the very difficult question of China. And I don't think the book really does talk much about China, but market reforms have gone way further in China than they ever did under Perestroika. And the Chinese, they had a second economy, and they dealt with it by shifting it from semi-legal to legal. They legalized it, and then they regulated it, and they got on top of it. But crucially, at the same time, They also made sure that they maintained overall state control of the commanding heights of the economy, over heavy industry, over energy, telecommunications, and finance, the banks. And combining that with maintaining Communist Party leadership, like maintaining a workers' state. Deng Xiaoping, who was, as you very well know, the kind of one of the key architects of the Chinese reform process from 1978, he always, he never tired of insisting on what he called the 4 cardinal principles. Number 1, defend the socialist path. Number 2, maintain the dictatorship of the proletariat, maintain working class rule. Number 3, maintain the leadership of the party. Number 4, adhere to Marxism-Leninism, adhere to Mao Zedong thought. And Deng sort of talked quite extensively about the type of democracy that China needed. And he was very clear, we don't want a bourgeois democracy. We don't need an individual democracy. We don't want a system whereby personal interests come above collective interests. We've got to exercise a working class rule. We've got to exercise a proletarian dictatorship over the elements, the capitalist elements that want to go back to capitalism, right? And to me, that's a very, very big, important difference between China and the Soviet Union that I don't think is really picked up that much in Kieran and Kenny's book, which is that the Chinese have always been very clear on maintaining working class rule. And, like they'll liberalize the economy, as I say, to a much greater degree than the Soviet Union ever did, but they haven't liberalized politics in the sense, when I say liberalize, I obviously say that kind of ironically. They haven't turned their system into a bourgeois type of system or the type of political system in which someone can come along with a load of money and win an election and to this small fraction of society, a capitalist class that wants to subordinate the national interest to the interest of making profit. To me, that's the fundamental difference between the Soviet and Chinese experiences. And it sort of feeds into, I think, a basic definition of what a socialist state is. And that's an interesting conversation, and maybe we haven't really got time to go into it too deeply. But in my view, the most important component of this question of socialism is the question of political power, right? Which class is in control? Which class or classes do the state forces represent? To me, that's much more important than what percentage of the economy is state-owned, what percentage of the economy is collectively owned, what percentage of the economy is privately owned. If a given socialist country decides that it needs some level of private ownership of capital in order to drive forward its development, well, I'm not going to object to that. Clearly, frankly, in China's case, it's worked extremely well. Obviously, as a caveat to that, the state needs to be able to exercise overall control over the economy, and it needs to exercise control of the commanding heights in particular. Otherwise, there's not a material basis for socialist power. But if a socialist country gives up on working class power, if a socialist country makes concessions to bourgeois democracy and allows a capitalist class to organize itself as the ruling class to capture power, we've had the Soviet experience, and we've had the experience of the other former socialist countries in Europe, and it indicates very clearly that that's a disaster. So, that's my kind of summary of my opinion on Kieran and Kenny's book. It's very good. It's I think in a number of ways, it's better than mine. It's more useful than mine. But this particular point is something that I think I probably emphasize a bit more clearly. But as I said, that's a relatively small critique. They're good comrades. I've been in email communication with them on these types of topics, so I'm definitely not bad-mouthing them.
That's very interesting, and I wonder to what extent that difference in that understanding can be traced back to the era of new democracy, because Mao and the CPC was very clear that there's this important distinction between the expropriation of political versus economic power. They were okay with not fully expropriating the economic power of the capitalists insofar as there was a full expropriation of political power, and the conditions were created so that regardless of how much the capitalists grew in the field of economics, they would have no influence in politics.
I think it stems from. I'm sorry, Carlos. Go ahead.
No, go ahead. No,
I was just saying. I think it stems from a very materialist view of how political power works. and how the economy drives that. It's a sort of subordination, right, of all economy to the political power, and one class just as its function repressing another. Not like, an intention of we're being mean and we want just not allowing it to grow. And I really like the way I'm rambling. I apologize. Go ahead.
No. We're probably getting off track a little bit, but it's. I think the point that Carlos made in relation to New Democracy is really important, because it sort of highlights as fact as well that the class basis of the Chinese Revolution itself was significantly different to that of the Soviet Revolution. The Soviet Revolution was very much a working class revolution, which took place in alliance with the peasantry, essentially because they said we're going to nationalize the land to the tillers, and we'll get the peasants on board. But Russia was a capitalist country. It was an imperialist country, and it was, in a sense, it was much more of a classic. Sorry, I muted myself. In Russia, there was much more of a classic working class socialist revolution, whereas in China there was a very broad social base for the revolution. It was built on the revolutionary dictatorship, the democratic dictatorship of the working class and the peasantry and the intellectuals, and under New Democracy came to incorporate the progressive and patriotic elements of the capitalist class as well. And so in a sense, you had that formed the same class basis, just 20 or so years later, with the launch of reform and opening up. So that was an option that was there, that was open to the Chinese in the way that it was never open to the Soviet Union.
That's fascinating. Thank you for that answer. I guess I'll move on to the next question. So many in the West see a break in China's socialist construction with the reform and opening up in the late 70s that took place. And in your work, you've argued for a continuity in their revolutionary project from 1949 up until modern day. I've argued the same thing in some of our YouTube videos with help from the Vijay Prasad's Tricontinental Institute, who in their report about China's poverty alleviation programs talk about the reform period being a deepening of the socialist construction rather than a break from it. However, China has made many adjustments and changes based on what they determined to be the primary contradiction at the time. So can you talk about the Chinese Revolution's continuity and how they use dialectical materialism to analyze principal and non-principal contradictions in the various eras or stages of the revolution?
I'll give it a try. This is a question for someone much smarter than me, but I think you're 100% right that dialectical materialism has been absolutely core to the whole Chinese socialist project from the beginning, analyzing within a framework of Marxist philosophy, whilst always rejecting dogmatism, always rejecting kind of rote learning or attempting to find kind of formulas and wave magic wands for building socialism. And I was just reading Xi Jinping's speech to open the 20th Congress. I just read it today, and he said something quite important on this. He says, taking Marxism as our guide means applying its worldview and methodology to solving problems in China. It does not mean memorizing and reciting its specific conclusions and lines, and still less does it mean treating it as a rigid dogma. We must continue to free our minds, seek truth from facts, move with the times, and take a realistic and pragmatic approach. And that kind of saying, that idiom, seek truth from facts, that's a real continuity of kind of Chinese communist thought from Mao onwards. Mao was very fond of that formula, seek truth from facts, as was Deng Xiaoping, as is Xi Jinping today. And that's, that's in terms of the continuities, that's really a common thread that runs throughout the history of the CPC and the Chinese Revolution. It's creatively exploring a path to socialism. It's obviously improving the living standards of the Chinese people. It's establishing and protecting China's unity, establishing and protecting China's sovereignty, making a contribution to the global struggle against imperialism, and cooperating with all of progressive humanity, particularly the developing countries, particularly the global south, particularly those countries that suffer or have suffered under imperialist and colonial oppression. In terms of your contradiction analysis and the definition of the principal contradiction, that's played a key role in driving Chinese policy, or the CPC's policy since the birth of the CPC in 1921 onwards. Like during the United Front period from 1937, the principal contradiction was defined as being between the Chinese people pretty much as a whole and the forces of imperialism, the forces of war, the forces of occupation. Following the founding of the PRC in 1949, that principal contradiction shifted and became between, on the one hand, the patriotic front that we talked about earlier, like that democratic alliance of workers, peasants, intellectuals, and patriotic capitalists, and the feudal class and the comprador bourgeoisie on the other hand. And that's the contradiction that drove forward this process of land reform, the start of industrialization, the start of modernization, social welfare programs, the rolling out of education throughout the country for the first time, the rolling out of healthcare throughout the country for the first time, and these programs that transformed the lives of literally hundreds of millions of ordinary Chinese people. So that contradiction analysis has really been essential to the success of the whole Chinese socialist project. In the Cultural Revolution period, Mao defined the principal contradiction as being as being a class struggle between the working class and the peasantry on the one hand, and the capitalist roaders in the CPC leadership on the other. And that was obviously very controversial. And the post-Mao leadership from Mao's death onwards, from 1976, led by Deng Xiaoping and others, felt that had been a mistake, that was incorrectly defined principal contradiction, and that the principal contradiction was really between people's ever-growing material and cultural needs on the one hand, and China's relative backwardness, its relatively backward productive forces on the other. And on that basis, they aim to put pieces in place such that China could provide a good standard of living to its whole population, to break out of backwardness, to become a world leader in science and technology. And you got to say that they were extremely successful in that project, and which is not to say that reform and opening up is not an inherently risky project, not to say that it doesn't have its own contradictions and its own complexities and its own problems. But, I think, we recently described it in an article on Friends of Socialist China, that what's transpired from that contradiction analysis has been the most rapid and dramatic economic transformation of any society in human history. And I think that analysis stands. And in terms of providing a good standard of living to the whole population, that's been achieved now. China's the second largest economy in the world. It's the largest trading partner of, I think, 140 out of just under 200 countries. It's eliminated extreme poverty, which is an incredible achievement, for a huge Asian country of 1.4 billion people that 70 years ago was one of the poorest countries in the world, for every single person to have guaranteed access to adequate food, housing, clothing, education, healthcare, and then for that country to be a global leader in several areas of science and technology, telecoms, renewable energy, artificial intelligence, high-speed rail, nanotech, quantum computing, etc. But then going back to the principal contradictions, the Xi Jinping administration, especially in the last few years, has shifted that principal contradiction again towards now being between, on the one hand, unbalanced and inadequate development, and on the other hand, people's ever-growing needs for a better life. And that's really kind of defined the basic political and economic strategy over the last years and for the coming years and for the coming period. Like she puts it in his Congress report, closing this gap between unbalanced development and people's needs should be the focus of all our initiatives. And that's where this idea of emphasizing quality over quantity in terms of the economy comes from, focusing less on GDP, more about equality, more about fairness, more about sustainability and green development. That's where the notion of common prosperity comes from. Like common prosperity has always been a key theme in the Chinese Revolution, but now it's really like become a core part of policy making. You've already had, like we've seen in the last year or two, this regulatory crackdown on the private education sector, measures to prevent gaming addiction among children, and generally, like there's been a bit of a crackdown on the tech industry, much stricter rent controls, a big attempt to stop people engaging in housing speculation, laws and regulations to protect the rights of workers in the gig economy. So strongly encouraging unionization of casual workers, which you very much don't get that in Britain and the US. Like in Britain, certainly, it's a real challenge to get employers to allow unionization of casual workers, never mind strongly encouraging unionization of casual workers. Gig workers in China now have to be given proper contracts, they have to be given insurance. And then combined with all of that, combined with common prosperity, you've got the ecological civilization, green development, renewable energy, biodiversity, reducing pollution. So all of these ideas come out of the new definition of principal contradiction and contradiction analysis, as you talked about in the question.
Well, I could sit here and talk all day about the brilliance of Xi Jinping, first of all. Especially just the way he talks and the subjects he talks about, I feel are really important to bring back to the West, because it's this foundationary ideas of Marxism that seem to be missing all of the time for us. But what you ended on, go ahead.
Before we go into the next question, I wanted to say you referenced Xi's speech, and there's something so refreshing, as Noah mentioned, something that's absent in the West, in his way of talking about Marxism as a worldview, as something that's connected to practice, that's applied, and that it's applied in every sphere of life. That I still refer as a scholar to Marxism as a worldview, and I'm looked at as if I'm Dracula or something by other Marxist academics in the West. You know, they shiver when they hear worldview. They've really embodied this postmodern fear of anything that sounds like a grand narrative or a worldview or laws or anything like that. So hearing Xi Jinping talk about Marxism as a worldview that's applied and that succeeds and that works, and the success of socialism with Chinese characteristics is because of Marxism and its worldview. That's just so incredibly refreshing. And your comments about these recent shifts with the Xi administration towards quality over quantity, I think those are so important. And you know, one of the texts that I recently got to read was Cheng and Fu's China's Economic Dialectic, and he talks about the development of metrics in order to measure this shift towards quality, right? Because you know, the consumption of an apple and the consumption of a cigarette are, in terms of quality, the same under a GDP metric. Their difference is quantitative. And if you switch towards quality, that's so important. And the metric that they have been developing is GDPW, which is gross domestic product of welfare. And I just think that's fascinating.
You know, it's funny. We were talking before we went live about having a dueling bookshelves. We should probably just like hold up all of the same copies of books we all have. But real quick, before we go into the next question again, I apologize that Eddie had to drop out. He's actually a Chinese bot that we programmed, and it glitched out on me, and I can't restart the computer during the interview, so we'll have to carry on without our Chinese bot. And when you spoke of the ecological issues in China and how they tackle them, so I kind of want to dig into that. Can you speak on China's ecological civilization and the role that Marxist ecology is playing in the socialist governance and construction? Maybe elaborate some of the ways it overcomes the sort of more superficial treatment we get against climate change here in the West, and, you know, greenwashing capitalism, that kind of thing.
The unmute button has suddenly disappeared.
Sorry, I got it. No, I was just I was looking for something that I had I'd read on this question today, which was an interview with John Bellamy Foster, who, as you know, is a kind of really been a trailblazer in terms of ecological Marxism. And you know, he gives this interview on the Chinese concept of ecological civilization. And he made a great point. You know, he was comparing it, you know, with what China's actually doing with what radicals and progressives are trying to accomplish in the West. And he says, you know, China's made moves to implement its radical conception of ecological civilization. While it's done that, you know, the notion of a Green New Deal has taken concrete form nowhere in the West. It's merely a slogan without any real backing within the system. And, you know, I think that's a really important point, and it relates to, you know, something we've been talking about already in this session. It relates to the basic structure of society and the social class, or the social classes in power. You know, we're talking about climate change and the threat of climate breakdown, or climate catastrophe. That's been understood for decades. You know, that's been at the very least kind of Rio Summit 1991, 1992. So 3 decades. There's been pretty much global agreement at the level of international policy making, international law, that climate breakdown is an existential threat for humanity. And for all of that time, the world's leading powers, which have been capitalist countries, have said, well, we're going to solve this problem via the market. You know, Say's law is going to come into effect. There's a need for this. There's a market, and enterprise will come to fill that gap in the market. You know, with market solutions to our environmental problems. And the result is we haven't made any progress. Actually, the problem is way worse than it was 10 years ago, 20 years ago, 30 years ago. And it just highlights to us so clearly that capitalism just isn't a suitable economic system in terms of fixing these enormous problems, like switching out energy systems, leaving fossil fuels in the ground, decommodifying large parts of the economy. Well, you know, that's not where we've been going. That's not what neoliberalism is all about, decommodification. Neoliberalism, which has been the dominant economic ideology for the last 40 years, it's the opposite of that. It's about commodifying as much of the economy as possible. But if you want to solve climate change, if you want to prevent, you know, planetary breakdown and crossing these various tipping points, we have to decommodify large parts of the economy. And that's exactly why it's the socialist world that's in the lead on this. Like, China has become by far the global leader in renewable energy, for example. It's responsible for 1/3 of all investment in new energy worldwide. Its innovations have already, like, because of the China's investment and Chinese innovations, like the overall cost of solar, wind power, hydropower globally have gone down to such an extent, like they've dropped to 10% of where they were 10 years ago, to the point where those energies are now price competitive with fossil fuel in most parts of the world, right? Like, China's total renewable capacity is greater than the US, the EU, Canada, Japan, and Britain combined. China's got like 99% of the world's electric buses, 70% of the world's high-speed rail. China's forest coverage, this is really impressive. Like, in the early 1980s, China's forest coverage was 12% of its territory. Now it's double that, 23, 24%. 20 years ago, coal made up like 80% of China's power mix. Now it's under 50%, which, by the way, is less than Australia, a wealthy and an advanced country that considers itself as something of a leader in environmental matters. And China's made these commitments to reaching peak carbon emissions by 2030 and getting to zero carbon neutrality by 2060. And, China's really good at getting things done. Like if China makes promises and makes commitments, it's going to keep those commitments. It's got a record of getting things done in that sense. And they've taken this idea of ecological civilization, of harmony between humanity and nature, and they've put it at the heart of their policy making. As I said in the quote from John Bellamy Foster at the beginning, the Green New Deal is like a nice idea. It's got some potential. We could probably do something with it, but it's got so little chance of getting implemented in any meaningful way. Like it's this fringe concept at the moment that you talk about it and you're some kind of lunatic. It's maybe got 1% support in US Congress. It's maybe got 1% support in the British Parliament, whereas in China, like the idea of ecological civilization, of really prioritizing ecological issues in front of everything, is a consensus opinion. And Xi Jinping's got a very famous quote on this. He says, "We've got to strike a balance between economic growth and environmental protection. In the future, we're going to be more conscientious in promoting green, circular, and low carbon development. We'll never again seek economic growth at the cost of the environment." So, what they're doing, what they're rolling out, it's similar to the Green New Deal, but on an enormous scale. And as I said, China can do these things because it's a socialist country. It's not a problem for China to decommodify energy systems when they're already decommodified. It's not a problem for the big banks to allocate resources in accordance with humanity's needs because those banks are state-owned. The banks have to be responsive to the demands of the people, not to the demands of shareholders. It's not a problem to shift priority away from GDP towards quality and sustainable growth when the whole purpose of your economy is to improve people's lives. And going back to what you were saying earlier about different metrics, ultimately, what a socialist economy, the purpose of a socialist economy isn't to produce exchange values, it's to produce use values, which is the fundamental, it's the whole basis of Marxist economics. When the political and economic system are responsive to the needs of the people rather than to the needs of capital, it's possible, like, you can achieve all of these things. Like, China's made this decision to pursue a path of sustainable development, and it can succeed in it in the way where the capitalist countries are failing. Obviously, there's a long way to go. China is still the biggest overall emitter of carbon dioxide. It has been for the last 15 years. But it's also undergone an incredibly rapid development where its people, the majority of people didn't have access to clean and improved water, didn't have access to modern energy, didn't have access to fridges and washing machines and things that genuinely kind of quite important to living a decent modern life, a decent life in the modern world. But having reached a stage of development where everybody's basic needs are met, China is increasingly focusing its resources on green and sustainable development, and in the process they're giving a great gift to the entire world.
That's so wonderfully said, because it overcomes these dichotomies and binaries that we set ourselves up in the West. That's the natural result of a non-dialectical outlook that people have towards the world, where in terms of ecology, you have on one side development and on the other side ecological life. And China has shown that you can have sustainable development, but that the precondition for that is a socialist economy that, as you said, can decommodify things and prioritize life, not just human, but planetary life. And you mentioned John Bellamy Foster, the work that he's done and really showing the ecological dimension of Marxist thought, and even just with the quote that you brought up from Xi about the harmony and the balance between production, development, and environmental boundaries, I guess, that comes kind of right out of Marx in Volume 3. He's talking about the rational metabolism of human society and nature as what communism ultimately is going to look like. I think that's wonderful. And I would like to now switch towards our next question, which relates to something I actually had a chance to get republished in the Friends of Socialist China concerning markets. A common attack levied at China by the ultra-left is that the existence of markets in China disproves the existence of socialism. However, pro-China scholars have argued that China's markets, built upon the industrial base laid during the Mao years, are socialist in character. Their work, building on Marx's, shows that if markets existed before capitalism and function in different ways in their feudal context or in their classical Greek and Roman context, why wouldn't markets also exist in a post-capitalist society and therefore work towards ends that are different than those of capitalist commodity production? Our question is, what do you see as some of the main differences between capitalist markets that dominate the West and the socialist markets in China?
Thanks. Yeah, another big question, and I'll respond with another reply that will earn me very few friends. First thing, it's kind of an obvious point, but there's nothing in Marx that says you can't have markets under socialism, right? Like, in a Marxist definition, socialism is a transitional stage between capitalism and communism, and it carries all sorts of baggage from the old society. Markets, competition, the profit motive, and so on, these have been introduced into China's socialist system in a very deliberate way in order to help China break out of underdevelopment. That's very pragmatic, and it's completely based on the Chinese conception of Marxism and seeking truth from facts. If a fully planned, centralized command economy were already achieving those aims, and were bringing about common prosperity, and were solving people's basic problems, and were pulling China close to the West in terms of science and technology and productivity, there would have been no need to introduce elements of a market economy. But that wasn't the case. The fact is that China in 1978, in spite of having made, let's be completely clear about that, the progress that China made under initial socialist construction from 1949 was incredible. It's really got no comparison in terms of scale and effectiveness in human history. But China in 1978 was still very poor, and it was still, relatively backward in a number of ways. Food production was insufficient. Socialism, like the socialist redistribution, meant that there wasn't starvation anymore. There weren't famines anymore, which is, it might sound like a small thing to those of us that live in the West in the 21st century. But for China, that's a fundamental break with Chinese history, that you've managed to move past famines, that you've managed to move past starvation. So socialism had achieved that, but there was still malnutrition. Still an awful lot of people didn't have a healthy and balanced diet. There were still hundreds of millions of people that didn't have access to modern energy and to improved, safe water piped into their homes. The per capita income was just over $200. That's a deceptive figure in a sense, because it's a very low amount in terms of how much disposable income you've got. But of course, going back to Marxist economics and what we were talking about before, there was a lot of the use values that were produced were given gratis to people. There was an incredible social welfare system, so people weren't paying for an awful lot of the things that they consumed. But meanwhile, the capitalist countries and capitalist regions nearby, Hong Kong, Japan, Thailand, Malaysia, were starting to develop very quickly. We're having a rapid takeoff, very specifically sponsored by the United States in order to outstrip China. But nonetheless, they were developing very quickly. You had lots of people fleeing from Guangdong in southern China, going into Hong Kong in the hope of improving their conditions of life. So the idea was to use markets to develop the productive forces. You have Deng Xiaoping talking about the fundamental task for the socialist stage being to develop the productive forces. A famous quote of his is that the superiority of the socialist system is demonstrated in the final analysis by the faster and greater development of those forces than under the capitalist system. As they develop, the people's material and cultural life will constantly improve. Socialism means eliminating poverty. Pauperism is not socialism, still less communism. Marx writes in volume 3 of Capital that capital has got a mission. It's got a historic mission. It's got a historic justification, and that is to develop the productive forces of social labor. He talks about how capitalism unwittingly creates the material conditions for a higher form of production. So the idea of reform and opening up is to push forward that process, not unwittingly, but purposefully, is to take on capital's historic mission, but within a framework of socialism, under the guidance of the Communist Party and in the interests of the working class. And what we end up with is a socialist market economy. How's that different from capitalism? How is that different from the neoliberal West, or from Japan, or from South Korea? Well, the key thing is that the basic economic agenda is set by the state, right? Public ownership continues to dominate. There's actually in China, there's been very little in the way of actual privatization. And if you think in terms of transferring ownership of state property to private capital, actually the state sector is much bigger than it was in 1978. It's several times bigger than it was in 1978. But private enterprise has obviously grown much faster. But the commanding heights that we talked about earlier, heavy industry, energy, finance, transport, communications, foreign trade, are all under state control. Finance is dominated by, they call the big four state-owned banks. And obviously finance has a very key influence over the entire economy because it controls the flow of resources. The land in China was never privatized. Land continues to be owned and managed at the village level. So that's the basic structure of the economy of China's socialist market economy is profoundly different to that of the West, to that of the capitalist countries. Another, we've got an expression in English in England. I don't know if the same is the case in the US, that the proof of the pudding is in the eating. Like in China, under reform and opening up, yes, you've got polarization, and yes, you've got inequality that you never had before, but poor people are living much better than they used to. Whereas under neoliberalism, rising wealth has always got its counterpart in rising poverty. As a whole number of reggae songs say, the rich gets richer, the poor gets poorer. But in China, ordinary people, working class people, peasants are living longer and living better. They earn more, they go to school for longer, they get better healthcare, they've got electricity in their homes, they've got clean water in their homes. They're still kind of cash poor, but their standard of living looks nothing like the standard of living of the poor elsewhere in Asia and Africa. If you go to India, what does it mean to be rural poor in India? It essentially means to be in debt bondage, for the rest of your life, and potentially, the rest of the next generation's life. It can mean to live among millions in peri-urban slums on the outskirts of Delhi, on the outskirts of Mumbai or Chennai or wherever. It can mean malnutrition. It can mean illiteracy. So, to be rural poor in China, but to have your guaranteed 19 years of education, and to have guaranteed healthcare, and to have your own plot of land that you're not in debt over and that doesn't belong to anyone else, and to have a home, and to have clothing, and to have food, that's like middle income life in most other parts of Asia and Africa. What neoliberal country has these major anti-poverty campaigns, right? Or what neoliberal country is the global leader in tackling climate change? If I could be permitted, would like to recall Fidel Castro's words about Chinese socialism, because he visited Beijing in 1993. And I think what he said about his trip is very insightful. He says, if you want to talk about socialism, let's talk about what socialism achieved in China. At one time, it was the land of hunger, the land of poverty and disasters. Today, there's none of that. Today, China can feed, dress, educate, and care for the health of 1.2 billion people. I think China's a socialist country, and Vietnam as well. And they insist that they've introduced all the necessary reforms in order to motivate national development and to continue seeking the objectives of socialism. There are no fully pure regimes or systems. In Cuba, for instance, we have many forms of private property. Practically all Cubans own their own home. And what is more, we welcome foreign investment. But that doesn't mean that Cuba has stopped being socialist. And I think what Fidel says there is incredibly important, and we should be clear that it's not just a matter of Fidel saying nice things about other socialist countries, because for 3 decades prior to that, China and Cuba had had pretty tense and complicated and difficult relations, a byproduct to the Sino-Soviet split, in which Cuba was mainly aligned with the Soviet Union. So, Fidel giving this assessment isn't just a matter of kind of squad goals type of deal, but it represents a very serious, a very thoughtful reflection and reevaluation of socialism with Chinese characteristics. And I think we should pay some attention to it.
I think it's funny about the whole not real socialism argument, right? Not only are they theoretically incorrect and think that Marx dreamed up some ideal society that if it doesn't have these characteristics, it's not real socialism, but they seem to have missed all of the progress that, is socialism for us. And if they would actually engage with the people who are responsible for this, the thinkers and the workers, and then see that exactly what they said they were doing has been accomplished and more, I don't think it's possible to have that same criticism anymore,
Yeah, I mean, well, what's certainly true is that if you have a class of people who own and deploy capital, then you've set up dangers, right? Because that's a class of people that wants to expand its power, that wants to expand its resources, that wants to pass its privileges down to the next generations, and so on and so forth. You've got a special interest group, and with resources at its disposal to turn those special interests into material reality. So to some degree, there's no question that markets and private capital and foreign investment and inequality undermine to some degree the socialist project, and they introduce a level of risk, a level of danger. But at the end of the day, that's the negative side. The positive side is that, as you say, the whole experiment has been extremely successful, and China has been quite firm about keeping this group under control. And I think the renewed emphasis on common prosperity is really about doubling down on that, is about preventing the kind of disorderly expansion of capital, as they put it, and making sure that China is still adhering to the 4 cardinal principles that we talked about earlier. And unfortunately, when you're trying to build socialism in a hostile world, in a world that remains dominated by capitalism, in a world that remains dominated by imperialism, in a world where the most powerful countries in the world would do anything to roll back your revolution and to get rid of your socialist project, there is no safety, there's no formula, there's no easy way, there's no kind of consulting. What does Marx say in the Communist Manifesto? What does Engels say in Socialism, Utopian and Scientific? It's not, there's no magic wands and there's no formulas. You have to take risks. You have to accept that that's part of the process. And sometimes that involves taking 2 steps forward and 1 step back. But as I say, the proof of the pudding is in the eating. China in 2022, more than 40 years after the start of reform and opening up, is still getting very strong. is still getting much stronger all the time. There is none of the stagnation that we saw in the Soviet Union. There's none of the kind of ideological deterioration and the lack of confidence, and the kind of increasing alienation of the leadership, increasing alienation of the party. The CPC remains extremely strong. It remains extremely popular. It continues to deliver increasingly good standard of life for the vast majority of people in the country, and therefore you have to say, well, the Chinese have done an extremely good job of adapting Marxism to their specific circumstances.
Real quick, we do have a version of that saying in America. It's the proof is in the pudding, which when I was a kid, I always pictured people digging through pudding for some kind of evidence. Anyway, go ahead, Carlos.
As soon as you mentioned that, the whole saying, I was like, where'd that last part come from? That's because it's always omitted in the American version. It's kind of like we got lazy, and it's just the proof is in the pudding.
It's always that we got lazy.
But it's so interesting that you mentioned that, because one of the things that I'd like to do is watch the vlogs of people from outside of China that speak English that are in China. And a lot of them have been there for years, and their experience is that 5 years means a lot in China in terms of the improvement of the various districts and stuff. So it's important to remember that socialism is not socialized poverty, right? That has nothing to do with socialism. And then perhaps the most central contradiction within capitalism is the contradiction that's created by the relations of production, limiting, holding back, functioning as a fetter for the productive forces. And, just to tie it back to the conversation we had at the beginning with the question about cultural life, we're seeing that not just in terms of the productive forces of tangible goods that serve as the material ground for people's lives, but also for cultural life, right? The relations of production under capitalism present fetters for the development of cultural life and for the development of material production. But yeah, I think that functions as a good segue to your next question, Noah.
I mean, I just want to kind of interject there that I think in the coming years, in the West, we're going to experience a huge kind of identity crisis as it becomes increasingly clear that China and the socialist world are the leaders in science and technology and in pushing forward cultural life, and in pushing forward multipolarity in terms of pushing forward a coherent global vision of peace and cooperation. And as ordinary Chinese working class people start to live better than us, that's going to cause a huge amount of kind of emotional upset and confusion. And as Marxists in the West, we need to understand how we can kind of leverage that towards pushing forward socialism in our own situations. But it's going to be a very interesting time, and I think the fact that that's kind of on the way, that China is already emerging in the way that it is, that's one of the big motivations for the new Cold War. That's one of the big motivations for the pivot to Asia and the escalations under Trump, the escalations under Biden, is demonizing China as much as possible and trying to suppress its rise as much as possible, so we don't get to that point where it's just abundantly clear that capitalism is past its use-by date and that socialism is the future.
You get hit by that when you watch these videos. There's this one guy that lives in a tier 8 city, so it's not one of the best cities in China, and it makes New York look like shit. We have people in the comments when we talk about China, bots that will come in and they'll say, why don't you just move there? I wish, I'd live better there, but my fight is here. But if I wanted to be comfortable, I'd probably move to China, because it's not just beautiful and nicer than New York, but you look at the streets and you don't see homeless people outside of buildings that are uninhabited. You just don't see that, because prosperity has been common. It's been shared. Everyone has been lifted up. And that's the complete opposite of what we have here. We have a D- infrastructure. The cities are crumbling, and outside of the nicest building, you have homeless people. It's just the spiritual life of the people in these cities it's destroyed. That's hard to see.
I live in the poorest big city in the entire country, Cleveland, Ohio. And our entire city is falling apart. You know, we have one of our major bridges is unsafe to drive on right now. They had to do emergency work on it, right? Because they just let it go because it's not profitable to fix. We have in Cleveland proper, there's literally a 60% adult illiteracy rate. That shouldn't happen in a city that also, I was just working on a professional baseball player's multi-million-dollar condo this morning, right? Like that shouldn't happen where that's right next door to it. There were homeless people outside a block away, you know? It's crazy. Anyway,
I mean, that's an amazing thing. Like going to China, going to big cities, going to Beijing, going to Xi'an, going to Guangzhou and whatnot. And you know, it's a developing country. It's a relatively poor country, but to be a country like that and to have solved the problem of homelessness, when we can't solve that in Britain, when we can't solve that in the United States. I mean, I dread to think what a tier 8 city looks like in Britain. It's a shack. But it kind of brings to mind a quote from Engels 150 years ago on housing, where he says, like, one thing is beyond dispute. There are already enough buildings for dwellings in the big towns to immediately relieve the housing shortage through a rational utilization of these buildings. This naturally can be realized only by the expropriation of the present owners and by transferring their houses to homeless workers or to workers presently living in overcrowded apartments. As soon as the working class conquers political power, such a measure, dictated in the interest of the public good, will be just as easy to carry out as are other expropriations by the existing state. And that's, you know, such an amazing point. And it's so funny that he says it 150 years ago, and 150 years later, no capitalist country has done that. No capitalist country has solved homelessness because the working class doesn't have power. The capitalist class has power, and it's not in the capitalist class's interest to solve homelessness. But a socialist country like China can solve homelessness.
And it's something we hear other versions of all the time, right? The housing, on the housing question. Anyway, let's go into my next question, because all this talk about right now, it does seem like the world must have been simpler in the first half of the 20th century sometimes. You know, the Soviet Union was the leader of the world revolution. The Comintern was going strong. And even the Communist Party USA seemed like it would be leading the American Revolution any day. Of course, then comes the Sino-Soviet split, the fall of the USSR, etc. With the all-important internationals gone now, what do you see as the future of working class internationalism? How central of a role do you see the Communist Party of China playing in this? Lately, they seem to be taking a much more active internationalist role as a product of their advancing productive forces, etc. But as we talked about earlier, they did arise out of a very national-oriented, anti-imperialist struggle.
Yeah, sure. Like, I guess, well, you know, one thing to say is that, you know, life probably wasn't that simple in the first half of the 20th century. Of course, like, you've got a major split in the communist movement in the run-up to World War I. You've got the failure of Western Europe to carry through socialist revolution when the time was right for it, again in the lead up to World War I. And then, you know, the defeat of the German Revolution in 1918. You've got the War of Intervention, where, you know, a number of Western powers came in to try and overthrow the October Revolution. You've got the line struggle in the CPSU, which affected the world movement and corresponded to the start of, you know, a parallel Trotskyist movement, the Fourth International, and so on. You've got then from 1929 onwards, the industrialization process in the USSR, the collectivization process, neither of which, by all accounts, was a dinner party. You've got World War II, in which 27 million Soviets gave their lives, tens of millions of Chinese gave their lives. You know, in a sense, it's kind of only when the second half of this 20th century rolls around that things probably started to feel a little bit more stable. You know, we've got the emergence of a socialist camp, you've got the Soviet Union, you've got China, you've got Korea, Vietnam, Eastern and Central Europe. Then a few years later, Cuba. You've got a wave of decolonization in Africa and the Middle East, which produces a group of countries that are broadly friendly towards the socialist camp. But yeah, of course, as you say, like major divisions and problems came up, and you've got to deal with these incredibly complicated and incredibly difficult contradictions, like the will on the one hand for peaceful coexistence versus the will for world revolution, nuclear weapons as a new factor in the situation, the Cold War, which wasn't particularly cold when it came to Korea and Vietnam and Indonesia and Brazil and Guatemala and elsewhere, Khrushchev, the 20th Congress of the CPSU, which is I think probably will prove to be a profoundly different experience to the 20th Congress of the CPC. De-Stalinization, like a certain undermining, I think, of the Soviet people's confidence and their ideological unity, the Sino-Soviet split, the closing of the Cominform in 1943, the Comintern rather, and I think that sort of feeds into some of the contradictions of, on the one hand, being a country like the Soviet Union, like the center of the world revolution, and on the other hand, being a country that wants to have peaceful state-to-state relationships with the capitalist world, that wants to be able to enjoy peaceful coexistence. And to a significant degree, all of these problems kind of reflect the difficulties that we talked about, like of trying to build socialism in a sea of imperialist hostility, and building as a result what Michael Parenti has referred to as siege socialism. And then you've got 1989 and 1991, and you've got the global working class experiencing what remains the worst defeat in its history with the collapse of the Soviet Union and European socialism. And that's an unmitigated disaster. And furthermore, it came about at a time when the Chinese overall strategy in terms of its foreign policy was still very much hide our strength and bide our time, right? Kind of trying to play nice with imperialism in order to have the space to develop in peace. And, who can argue with the need to develop in peace? As for what's the future of working class internationalism, I mean, that's another question that's a little bit above my pay grade. And in the more recent period, China in particular has been promoting a more overtly anti-imperialist internationalist approach. Obviously, the CPC maintains excellent party-to-party relations with other communist parties, with other progressive parties around the world, and it's working to facilitate dialogue among those parties. But the CPC also has to be realistic. Like, I don't think China's on the cusp of kicking off a new communist international and setting itself up as a new center of global revolution. Because, China also wants peaceful coexistence. China also doesn't want to be accused of exporting revolution. China also doesn't want to give the US and the other major capitalist powers ammunition to use against it. And ultimately, it's up to movements and parties in their own countries to find their own path to socialism. And if the 20th century teaches us anything, it's that there's not just one socialist path. There's not just one socialist model. So if we're waiting for China to give us, the resources and a sort of dummy's guide to building socialism in the West, well, we're going to be waiting a while. But what China is very active on is promoting multipolarity, is promoting the UN Charter, the principles of the UN Charter, respect for sovereignty, rejecting interference, rejecting war, promoting peace, rejecting unilateral sanctions. And it's not necessarily framed in terms of anti-imperialism, but it is fundamentally anti-imperialist because it's anti-hegemonic. In a multipolar world, countries can figure out their own development paths without being held to ransom by the West, without being subjected to regime change and wars and sanctions and destabilization and economic coercion and so on. So I think there is a really important internationalism that's emerging around that question. And I think it's really important for those of us in the West to support that process, to oppose US imperialism, oppose European imperialism as part of our job of opposing our own ruling classes and developing our own paths towards socialism. We should be supporting multipolarity. We should be supporting the sovereign development of the global South as an indispensable component of proletarian internationalism today, in my humble opinion. There's lots of interesting projects that are emerging, relatively small scale projects where we're coordinating and cooperating more with one another in different countries and sharing experiences and developing some kind of, I guess, grassroots working class internationalism, the type of work that you guys are doing. I'm also involved in, aside from Friends of Socialist China, the International Manifesto Group, which tries to coordinate with different individuals and different groups around the world, broadly speaking, on the basis of a Marxist-Leninist and anti-imperialist analysis. So there's projects going on, but I don't think we're going to see a return to the sort of big picture internationalism of the first half of the 20th century.
I think that's very well said. It's a shame that that Dummy's Guide to Building Socialism would have been nice, especially if it would have had those pop-up pictures that children's books have. But yeah,
that's the next book, man.
We're American. We need the pop-ups.
We got to get that through our publishing press. But you mentioned your response reminded me of part of this movie that Owen Wilson starts in. It's called Midnight in Paris. I don't know if you guys have seen it, but he's a writer in Paris, and he's like really fetishizing the 1930s Paris scene, and he gets picked up by a car, and it takes him to the 1930s, and he gets to hit it off with the lover of Picasso and Hemingway, and then she gets picked up by a car, and she goes to her dream era, which was 1970s Paris. So
that's when he meets Zoolander, right?
No, I don't think so. But there's this constant romanticization of the past, and I do think that if we take a look at our situation today, it's pretty darn good to build socialism. And the conditions in the U.S., the objective conditions for revolution, I think couldn't be any riper. Perhaps they're getting too ripe that they're beginning to sour up. I think, at least in my assessment, what's really missing is the subjective factors and the organizations that can do what's needed in order to push our people into developing collective socialist consciousness, class consciousness, and organizing in a revolutionary manner. But I wanted to perhaps end with our last question concerning something that we've kind of tiptoed around, but maybe hitting it more directly here, which is the 20th Congress of the CPC, which just took place a few days ago. A lot of Americans don't really know what happens at a Communist Party Congress. Can you speak a bit about what the Congress is? What are the sorts of things that it presupposes in terms of meetings and assemblies? What are some of the central focuses in this Congress specifically? And what are the next few years of socialist governance in China going to look like?
Okay. So the National Congress of the CPC, this is its 20th National Congress. It is about, well, it brings together just over 2,000 elected representatives of the Communist Party from all over the country. And, it starts by reflecting on the previous 5 years since the last Congress, and kind of setting the tone for the party's strategy and the party's policy in the coming years. Like, it's what's agreed at this Congress will have a huge impact on what China does in the coming 5-10 years, going forward, for decades. So it's an incredibly momentous event. It's not just a kind of formality. There are very serious discussions that are being had that will affect all of China, and because China is an extremely important country, an extremely big country, will affect all of humanity. So, we're all interested, or we all should be interested in what's happening at this Congress. In terms of the direction that the party in China as a state are likely to take in the coming years, I mean, as I said, I've read Xi Jinping's speech, very long, 60-page speech, which was made to open the Congress. And it's interesting to see some of the themes. And, a lot of it comes back to conversations that we've already had on this stream. But essentially, the big picture is, the big headline is putting the pieces in place for achieving what the Chinese call their second centenary goal, which is, they had the first centenary goal, which was to achieve what they call a moderately prosperous society by 2021, last year, which was the centenary of the CPC, and which they achieved with the eradication of extreme poverty. The second centenary goal is for the centenary of the founding of the People's Republic of China. So that will be 2049, so the middle of the century. And the wording of that goal is building a great modern socialist country that is prosperous, strong, democratic, culturally advanced, harmonious, and beautiful. And that's a pretty broad goal and a pretty broad theme. But the sub-themes that come under that are particularly common prosperity, which we've talked about. The Chinese leadership talks a lot in terms of cake theory. There's a debate. There's always been a debate within Chinese economics of, do we focus on making the cake bigger, or do we focus on sharing it more fairly? And the formula for the moment is that we're both making it bigger and we're sharing it more fairly, and a fairer distribution of the benefits of China's rise is a really key theme that's emerging from this Congress so far. Another one is, again, doubling down on ecological civilization. So Xi Jinping says in his speech, China is committed to sustainable development and to the principles of prioritizing resource conservation and environmental protection and letting nature restore itself. We will protect nature and the environment as we protect our own lives. So that's an indication of how seriously they're taking ecological civilization, which is their Green New Deal times by 100. There's a big push on scientific innovation, technical innovation, and along with that, like a special emphasis on self-reliance, which is not, about a principled autarky. It's a response to the new Cold War. It's a response to the trade war. It's a response to the tech war. It's a response to these increasingly coordinated and systematic efforts to contain and suppress China. There's fighting corruption and fighting bureaucracy have kind of been major signposts of the Xi Jinping administration so far. And in terms of the details that have come out of what's been talked about at this 20th Congress, then that's going to continue to be a very major theme, like strengthening the party, continuing to increase its popularity, continuing to increase the popular trust in the party, which was really to some degree starting to break down 15 and 20 years ago, when corruption at every level was a really big problem. Like, I've spoken to my friend in Beijing who has been living there for 30, 40 years, who was saying that there was a point in time when you just couldn't get anything done. You couldn't get your tap fixed in your apartment building, in your social housing unit, without paying a bribe and things like that. Things like that just cause immense irritation and frustration among ordinary people. So they've, in the last 10 years, there's been a real crackdown on corruption and bureaucracy, and that's going to continue because it's been extremely important to the kind of overall health of the Chinese socialist project. There's a big focus on recruiting a new generation of party leaders, with a particular focus. Xi Jinping specifically mentions the importance of recruiting more youth and developing more women leaders, developing more ethnic minority leaders, developing more industrial workers as leaders. There's going to be a continued push on promoting multipolarity, promoting peaceful development, everything that we've come to think of as the Chinese approach to international relations, win-win cooperation, the principles of non-interference, promoting the interests of the developing world, promoting the interests of the global South, the Belt and Road Initiative, the Global Development Initiative, the Global Security Speech. And again, from Xi's speech, he says, we'll be dedicated to peace, development, cooperation, and mutual benefit, and will strive to safeguard world peace and development as we pursue our own development. I wish more world leaders would speak in those terms. Certainly on the military front, there's inescapably going to be a need to modernize China's military and to adapt it to the reality of a rising imperialist aggression. That's a project of encirclement. Look at what the Biden administration has been doing in relation to Taiwan, Pelosi visiting Taiwan, increasingly treating it as an independent country, encouraging and funding and arming separatist forces, undermining the One China principle that's been in place for close to 50 years, increased freedom of navigation assertion activities in the South China Sea, warships just off China's coastal waters, the formation of this AUKUS military pact, which is essentially a deal for the US and Britain to provide weapons-grade nuclear material for Australian submarines so that they can patrol the region on behalf of the US-led imperialist alliance, a focus on the Quad, the RIMPAC Pacific military exercises, war games that are very obviously directed strategically against China, encouraging Japan's rearmament, the attempts basically to project a global NATO that can be used to dominate the Asia-Pacific region, that can be used as part of a China containment project. So yeah, absolutely. One of the things that's being discussed at the National Congress is the need to modernize the military and enhance the military. But, I think it's on that note worth bearing in mind that China has a fundamentally defensive military strategy that it has always stuck to. China hasn't been at war for 43 years. That's something that you certainly can't say about Britain, something that you certainly can't say about the United States. China is also, China's a nuclear power country, but a nuclear weapons country, but it's the only country that has a strict policy built into its constitution of no first use. That is, China will never use nuclear weapons first. It will only use them as a counterattack in self-defense. So, as I say, the really key themes are common prosperity and ecological civilization, and the push on modernization and scientific technical innovation, particularly on the basis of self-reliance and countering the new Cold War, countering this hybrid warfare that China's facing.
Wonderfully said, brother. Thank you so much for the interview. There's an incredible amount of important topics that were touched and developed. Is there anything you would like to plug before we go? Anything, your personal stuff or group work?
Well, I'm tired now. It's late over
Welcome
here.
to my world, brother.
Yeah.
After these streams, the only thing you could do is eat a box of chocolate and drink a bottle of wine. That's my go-to after these long streams.
That's a good idea. I'm going to read my book and go to bed. No, I mean, my kind of major project that I'm working on is that I'm co-editor of Friends of Socialist China, which is a platform that's based on kind of promoting understanding of and solidarity with Chinese socialism. I think that's a big gap in the market. That's something that is really kind of useful to comrades across the world, but particularly in the West. There's a real lack of understanding of what's happening in China and the basis of Chinese socialism. So myself and fellow co-editors who are Keith Bennett and Danny Haifeng, really focused on pushing that project forward. Beyond that, obviously I've got the book on the Soviet Union, The End of the Beginning, which is, I would say, kind of not bad, probably worth a read. I'm just finishing putting together a book about Chinese socialism now. which hopefully will be complete by the end of this year. And then thinking about an edited volume for Iskra Press on the New Cold War, and various other kind of writing projects in the works. But I can be found on social media and all the usual places. And just want to say thanks very much to you guys for putting up with my rants for coming up to a couple of hours now. So it's a really interesting session. Hopefully a useful discussion for you guys.
Absolutely. The pleasure's all ours, brother. Thank you so much for coming on. It means the world to us.
Thanks everyone who watched. And that description of your book, not bad. That can make it as a blurb in the. It's not bad. No, it's you're too humble. It's a wonderful text. I just recently read it, maybe 2-3 weeks ago. So thanks again, Carlos, for coming on, and thanks to everyone who watched. And solidarity.
Bye, everybody. Peace.